Welcome, everybody, to the Sodercast. I'm not sure what to call this. This is not really an official thing, but this is basically just me hanging out with my good friend Joffre Swait to talk about his new book, Word Horde, The Rhetoric of Poetry. So, Joffre and I go way back. I won't bore you with all the details, but
way further back than a lot of people know.
That's true. That's true. Maybe we should just, the lore. So we're both on the East Coast. I was in North Carolina. You were in South Carolina. Part of the CREC church is there. Our paths crossed occasionally. And then we both came out to Moscow in 2020, the Great Migration. And
right.
just in time for
there are photographs. Sorry, there are photographs out there of our kids dancing together when they were little in Carolina.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, our boys loved playing with your boys on the rugby team and being coached by you. And now we work at Kepler together. So, but yeah, was it last year or the year before you had me on to talk about my book, John Brown of Haddington, on frequent communion? So I wanted to return the favor, but also make sure people knew about this book. There's still time to get it and add it to your curriculum for this year. So the book is Word Horde, published by Roman Roads Press. So yeah, could you start off just talking about your multicultural, multilingual background? There's a great paragraph here where you talk about your ancestry and all that. So yeah, just so what was that like, and how did that help you, I guess, prepare you to be the poet you are now?
Yeah, so I was born in Brazil, kind of grew up in Brazil, back and forth between Brazil and the US and Canada. My mom was raised in Latin America, in Peru. And so between Peru, Chile, Brazil, Canada, the US, I just grew up around three languages. Grew up in a very literary family, especially through my mother. And mostly the literary angle was primarily through English, but we did everything in Portuguese and Spanish and English. So one of the ways I've applied this to the book actually is that, and I think it's a perspective that's relatively unique that I can lend to this textbook, which is that not just thinking about poetry, but poetry in English, right? Even if you're monolingual, which most of us are, right? So you only know English, you would only know how to write poetry in English, but understanding what the instrument of English is capable of, right? And thinking of poetry in technical ways, I think having a multilingual background can kind of help have insight or give insight into some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always amazing to me how many languages various poets know, and how many of them are involved in the work of various translation and things like that. So to be a poet is to love words, and so it seems like you have a very unique background, been able to draw from these different languages and to bring them all together. Okay, very good. So yeah, you had a literary homeschool education. So when did you first fall in love with poetry?
I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I was still in the single digits age-wise. And by the time I was 11 or 12, I was writing poetry. I think that it happened principally through just reading Tolkien and Lewis all the time. I had entire sections of the Lord of the Rings memorized by the time I was 10, particularly in the Return of the King, as the Battle of Pelennor Fields approaches, and during the Battle of Pelennor Fields. And like one of the passages that still impacts me to this day is when Eomer speaks his poetic lines when he thinks he's about to make his last stand. But just those books are just full of poetry. It never occurred to me that poetry might be for sissies. which is, I think, something some people have to overcome. It never even crossed my mind. It seemed to me that poetry was the manliest thing I could possibly do, since Aragorn and Eomer loved poetry. So yeah, by the time I was 11 or 12, I was already writing poetry and trying to share it with people and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, if people just read the Bible, they know that poetry is not for sissies, right? King David, killed all those Philistines and also wrote poetry. The Greeks, the ideal, a great warrior, a good man is a great warrior and a good poet. So your book, I think, really, one goal you say here somewhere is that you really want to convince young men that they should care about poetry. So yeah, can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would like all humans to care about poetry,
Right.
but I think there is a bit of fear of poetry on the part of young men, and not just endemic to the young man himself, but to the people around him, right? Like, I don't think there are many dads out there encouraging their sons to be poets, and I think that's a mistake. You mentioned the Greeks having this idea of virtuous men being skilled with words and being poets. Something I unpack in Word Hoard, which is, of course, is an Anglo-Saxon Old English expression, is how the Northern Germanic peoples had an idea very much like that as well, right? That if you were a king, of course you're a poet, and the best kings are poets, and just the society that values poetry. So I think that when we're talking as Christians about dominion, we should take pride in mastering words, and there is no finer expression, no greater expression of the dominion, the mastery of words, than poetry. And this textbook is a poetry textbook, but it's not called The Rhetoric of Poetry for nothing. I want people to conceive of it primarily as a rhetoric curriculum. I truly believe that poetry is the ultimate way to teach rhetoric. I don't necessarily want everyone who picks up this book to become an avid and dedicated poet, but I would like them to do all things poetically. And I think that many Christian parents will agree that something they want for their children is that they all master words, that they all be rhetoricians and be able to speak well, young men and young women. And there's no excuse. We excuse boys, young men, from their obligation to use words well. And I want to fight that.
Yeah. Amen to that. It's amazing all the Zoomer slang I'm sometimes exposed to. Yeah.
Like what?
I don't even know. It's just things that kids say. But I guess maybe that shows that that each generation wants to be distinctive somehow. So each generation has its own slang, right? And so there's this need to define ourselves by our words. And so yeah, if we can give our students and our own young people a sense of their heritage of language. I think so. Language always is a way that we identify and that we ourselves by. So yeah, to replace slang with something more substantive, that would be fantastic.
Well, and even having the ability to use English and use language at any level to do as much as language can do. Think of it like the visual arts. One of the things that is so utterly unimpressive about so many contemporary artists, people say, "Oh, my 5-year-old could do that," which that may or may not be true. But a lot of those painters are actually, because they have not been trained and because we have rejected anything formal and the various levels and degrees of visual art that there might be, we have painters who are actually incapable of painting a portrait or painting a landscape. So when they decide to splatter a canvas, it is utterly unimpressive. It is the only thing they can do, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
if you're going to splatter a canvas, at least show me that, look, I am capable of all these things, and I think this is best for this moment. And it's the same with speech. So perhaps there is a moment when slang is the perfect mot juste, right? Like this is exactly the precisely the phrase that we all needed, and we're all blessed by it now. But I am able to deploy it in that way because I can use my language at any level with any depth.
Bars, no cap, on jaw.
Thanks, brother.
No, that's a good point. I was just in Philadelphia. I got to go to the wonderful museum there, saw the Rocky Steps and all that. But they had several pieces by Picasso. And of course, most people think of Picasso with, all the crazy, cubist sort of things. But they had other paintings where it's just normal, beautiful stuff. So he could paint in whatever style he wanted to. So whether you like him or not, you have to respect that. So yeah, a good poet should be also, or someone who uses words should be able to do that as well.
Well, and what you say about, sorry, if I could just make a one comment about Picasso, and kind of riffing off that, you're able to do a lot of things in a lot of different ways. After you go through Word Horde, you will have written a few sonnets. Even if you never write another sonnet again, the point wasn't learning to write sonnets. The point was learning to craft words, and you will always do that for the rest of your life.
Right. But I thought AI was just going to do that for us, right?
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh man.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I'm not going to take that bait.
Oh goodness. So let's talk about your definition of poetry, or your description of poetry. How would you describe poetry?
Actually, I might describe and define them in the same way. So if you'll allow me to do that, I'll actually use what I've used in the book. I try to have as open an attitude about poetry as I can. Basically, if something portrays itself as poetry, I accept it as poetry. Now the question then becomes: is it good poetry or is it bad poetry? So my definition, my working definition of poetry, and it's one I include in the book, is poetry is elevated language. And that's it. Now that's in chapter 1. By chapter 3, and we can dive down this rabbit hole if you wish. By the time we talk about God, the nature of God, what humans are for, the transcendent, and poetry is elevated language becomes poetry is elevated language that glorifies God. At least that's what good poetry is. So chapter 1 asks what poetry is. Chapter 2 talks about bad poetry. And then in chapter 3, we kind of get to that. Poetry is elevated language that glorifies God. Or at least for a non-Christian, I think we would still say that, or at least that good poetry glorifies God. But certainly we would say it reaches for the transcendent.
Right. Yeah. I was just reading a little piece about a poet I'd never heard of, to show my ignorance. Paul Celan. I'm not sure how you say his last name, but he was a survivor of the Holocaust, Jewish and all that, but just really struggled, as so many of that generation. Eventually took his own life, but his writing was a yearning of trying to connect, with the transcendent, and so we see that so much, especially modern poetry. So yeah, well, I do like how you start off the book with the big picture. It's a very theological beginning, philosophical beginning, and so you do a good job of laying of setting that vision for poetry before getting into the brass tacks of what makes poetry actually poetic. So that and again, I would commend the book to anyone. Just the first 3 chapters are just really, really good about the whole worldview in which poetry makes sense. So it's not just a book on how to write poetry. Just want to throw that out there.
Thank you.
Oh, right. Well, so you're a poet yourself. Not only have you written about poetry, but you actually write poetry. And those are not always the same for people, right?
Right.
There's that teachers are those who can't do the thing that they teach. But you actually do write poetry. So what is your writing process like? Do you just wake up at night and say, oh, I'm inspired, I'm going to write this down? Or
that does happen sometimes. So my main process is to just always have a notebook at hand, and that's it, right? So, but it's less that I suddenly snap awake in the middle of the night. That has happened, and I have a notebook at hand. But the idea is, especially given my work, I'm often reading books or listening to things or writing something for work. So then having something where I can start kind of writing down some of my own ideas or thoughts or just commonplacing, honestly. And very, very often just writing down someone else's clever turn of phrase or lyric sets me down a path to writing a poem. So always having a notebook at hand is the main thing. I do sometimes go through phases where I say, well, I'm going to write X amount per day. But I don't hold myself to that for long. A couple of years ago, I worked for a couple straight years on a very long poem. And so that was a more that actually felt often like sitting down and writing a novel, and actually churning through, because it was that sort of project. But really, usually it's just having a notebook at hand with a pen in my pocket.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any certain styles of poetry that you like to use or just find yourself going back to more often, or do you try and do a wide variety of things?
I try to do a wide variety of things. I do, like, if I just start writing, and it's just kind of flow of consciousness, then I often write in these quatrains and 4-line verses, usually tetrameter, sometimes pentameter. And I've even noticed a tendency to set those up with ABBA rhyme schemes, which I only recently realized are far more common in Latin languages than in English. So I don't know if there's something leaking in there, but that's actually what I wrote Women of Greece in, that long project. And it's what I have another kind of longer ongoing project that I also write in that form. But yeah, I'll just because often I'll write a rhyming couplet and then walk away from it. So these are my more recent notebooks, and they're nearby because I often return to them, right? And I just flip through, and so I might write just a couplet, right? Just 2 lines, and come back to it a few days later, or a few weeks, or a few months later, and write something off of that. So there really is a lot of variety in how that might happen. I might start off thinking I'm writing a sonnet and then end up with something completely different. Which, by the way, I do write in blank and free verse, and both blank and free verse, a lot of people don't really understand exactly what those are, even what the difference is. But there is no such thing as formless poetry. And so sometimes we can get overly formalist. I mean, there are people who say they right. It's like, well, bad poetry, good poetry. But there's even any sort of language that thinks about what it is, right, that is elevated, that is reaching toward the transcendent, is going to pay attention to the elements of language and apply those to the elements of poetry. And so there will be music. So I often write in free verse, and there's music to it.
Yeah, good points. All right, let's see. Well, I hope that's encouraging to people, that you don't have to just sit down and be like John Milton and start to dictate this long epic poem. Just write things down, fragments here and there, and just collect things. And so it doesn't have to spring out of your mind full formed, like the goddess Athena, right?
Right, exactly. And Milton's actually a great example, because he is most known for what he did in his dotage, right? But even as a young man, he was a very active poet, and he wrote his whole life. And then at the end, we get magnificent sonnets, and of course, his master oeuvre.
Okay. Well, we will look forward to what you produce in your old age.
Thanks, man.
So speaking of Milton, he's obviously one of the giants. Who are some of your poetry heroes, or your favorite poets?
I mean, I really like Milton, and I mention him because he deeply influenced the poetry and the philosophy of poetry of a poet who is one of my favorites, one of my heroes, and someone I imitate. Was Gerard Manley Hopkins, a Jesuit poet, end of the 19th century. Didn't really become known until his friend, who Robert Bridges, who was poet laureate of England at the time, published. He used his clout and the fact that Hopkins had died and wouldn't complain about it anymore. Published Hopkins' poetry, and so his poetry is deeply Anglo-Saxon, deeply English. He was inspired by how Milton, in Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, tried to move toward a more English poetry, and that's actually one of my favorite things about all the Elizabethan poets. Just how very, very English they are. And during the Enlightenment, English poetry kind of moved back away from that. But anyway, Hopkins. I really like Eliot. And it's kind of lovely to me how T.S. Eliot, he became a Christian. And so his, the poetry that everyone knows from the high school anthologies that that are in the public schools, where he's lost and crying out and kind of hopeless. I don't think I'd really enjoy it if I didn't know that by the end of his journey he had found Christ, and we get to things like Murder in the Cathedral, or most importantly, Choruses from the Rock, which I absolutely love. So maybe I would include as a third person. So we've got Hopkins, we've got Eliot, and then I might go for Sir Philip Sidney, just because he was a fully well-rounded poet who dedicated himself to verse translations of the Psalms, as well as sonnets, etc., and died on the battlefield, or at least from wounds received on the battlefield. So fully a man, a Reformation man. I don't say Renaissance man, a Reformation man who, among other things, he was a politician, he was an artist, he was a courtier, a diplomat, a soldier, and he is remembered today as a poet, because a man should be all those things.
Amen. Back to our theme there. That's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk more about the book here. So the book was just published a couple months ago. So what's your big hope for the book, besides selling lots of copies?
Well, I would love to see it sort of become a standard, or be placed among the standards in the classical Christian education world for rhetoric finishing. That's how Roman Roads has placed it. So they've placed it after their standard rhetoric curriculum. It's for end of high school, beginning of college, and I'd really like it to kind of. My hope is that it'll assume that place. They'll be like, "Oh yeah, word hoard. That's a great way to finish an education." homeschooling, of course, but I even love for schools to pick these up. I also have kind of separate hopes for the anthology. I'd even love to be able to do more than one anthology, but there's an anthology that accompanies this. Poems Every Christian Should Know is the subtitle that I've given it, and I would love for that anthology to sell like hotcakes, as you said, sell a lot of copies. But the thing that excites me about the idea that it might sell a lot of copies, and to people who aren't even like buying the rest of the curriculum, right? A bunch of 70-year-olds, and like, let's just everybody buy this anthology. My hope with that is that we can begin to restore this idea that there is Christian culture and that there is therefore Christian poetry. And the poems in this anthology are not only poems that we might call Christian poetry. Again, it's poems every Christian should know. But we've sort of allowed with the arts generally, but with poetry, we've allowed the world to say what's good or bad. And I would really like us to be developing our own tastes. And following that, we would be developing our own artists. I just think it's very natural. If we have our own poets, our own rhetoricians, our own speakers, our own writers, then we're gonna have our own standards, and it's not going to be the world standards. The world may tell us that Jackson Pollock is awesome. The world may tell us that Allen Ginsberg is awesome. We are under no obligation to engage with that.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, good. I'm glad you brought up the anthology. I also wanted to talk about that. So yeah, it's a separate book. It stands on its own. I was intrigued as I was scanning through the authors listed. There were quite a few that I had. Now I fancy myself a fairly educated person. I read through the top 500 poems. I've made it through part of the Oxford Book of English Verse, but some of these poets I had not heard of. So how did you find them? Or is this just you went looking for these people, or you just found them along the way in your reading journey? Or
yeah, along the way in my reading journey. And before I address that directly, let me just say how refreshing your attitude is. I've gotten several messages from people like, love that you had George Herbert. How could you not include this particular one from George Herbert? Which, any selection like this, of course, that's going to happen. And I really do honestly hope to get a volume 2 and a volume 3 would be wonderful. But no, so, once I became sort of conscious as a child of my love for poetry, and my first job actually as a kid was at a used bookshop. So when I was 14, working at a used bookstore in New England, and I just started buying books, and I still own a lot of those books. One of them was the Oxford Book of English Verse, the 1918 edition. And that one in particular, but I've flipped through a lot of anthologies over the years in my day. But that one in particular, I often flip through. And, the great thing about anthologies, including hopefully the Word Horde anthology, that you don't have to feel any obligation to read it from front to back unless you're that sort of person. But, I would love for the anthology to live in your house and get picked up occasionally. That's what anthologies are great for. You just flip through. And I didn't really like this one. You never go back and read that one, and that's okay. That's fine. Or maybe 20 years later, you pick it back up and realize, oh, this was awesome. So yeah, these poets are poets that I knew just from just being a lover of poetry. As and not to say that you're not a lover of poetry, please forgive me. But there is particularly, I think, the way we pursue the word, the written word, the spoken word, academics. Poetry is not considered. Poetry tends to be considered ancillary, or it's a little whipped cream and cherry on top. It's an extra expression. I think it's core. I think it's fundamental, and I think the subsequent generations of classically educated young people are going to have a little bit more of that. So my hope is that there will be greater recognition. And there are some poets that I've discovered late. Like, it was this decade that I really became aware of Thomas Traherne, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Very good, very good. Well, yeah, I'm not a great poet, but I do enjoy it. This summer, I've been working through the collected poems of Emily Dickinson and W.H. Auden, and read my first volume of what's his name? What's his name? Ted
Ted
Kooser.
Hughes, perhaps?
No,
Okay.
Ted Kooser. Yeah, he was the U.S. Poet Laureate. Yeah, really good. He's a good example. He just writes a lot about American farm life. He was like a businessman his whole life, like T.S. Eliot,
Yeah.
a poet. But he writes about just like life on the farm or life in the Midwest. It's it's boring subject matter on one hand, but then he brings out the transcendent aspects of his grandmother's plates, or just anyway. So
the
yeah.
consummate example of that is I would proffer another American poet, Robert Frost. It's it really the things he writes about, including the ones that people know from anthologies. They're very just commonplace things. People going for a walk, just chilling in town or in the woods, and suddenly you're at heaven's portals. It's Frost is, I think, the consummate poet of that sort.
Yes. Yeah, and this past year I also read through C.S. Lewis's poems again. I was just like, it's just one poem a day, but they're so good.
Yeah.
I don't think enough people realize what a genius he was.
Yes.
Writing all these
And the
different
poetry actually is sort of proof of that.
yeah.
So there's a narrative poems book out there, and then there's a just poems.
Yeah.
The narrative poems, okay, but the that shorter book of poems, or the book of shorter poems, wow. I mean, I just yeah. So I'm a dog earer. That offends some people. I dog ear, and I dog ear my poetry volumes, and that one is it's just,
Yes.
it's very much marked up with favorites.
Yeah. I want to say hello to our audience. Thanks, Carly, for joining us. Amy, Marie, Benjamin, Ben, and Emma Pilcher. Thanks for joining us. Hanging out with poet Joffre Swait. So we'll wrap up pretty soon. But yeah, just before I have you read some of your own poetry, can you just remind everybody, we've talked about it again, but just to wrap up, why should all Christians read poetry and put in some effort to understand it? I mean, there are people, some in my own family, maybe, not going to name any names, but they don't like poetry. They say it's not clear, it's confusing. So why should we put in the work to understand it?
So the beginning of the Silmarillion, Tolkien talks about the creation of the world, and in the creation of that world, the world is sung into existence, and is very beautifully written. It's a beautiful story. The world was not sung into existence; it was spoken into existence, right? And Tolkien was kind of sub-creating off of that. We are made in the image of God. We serve the Logos who made the world, spoke the world. And we are so much made in his image that the first words spoken by man in scripture are poetry. And then that's not just like, oh, isn't that pretty? No, technically, the first words Adam says are poetry in Genesis. The ultimate use of logic, of words, the ultimate way to shape reality through words is poetry, right? That is the most crafted, the most elevated. So as Christians, we are obligated to exercise dominions. As Christians, we are obligated to make as best as we can the way God makes, and God makes by speaking. So we should all study poetry, read poetry, enjoy poetry, hopefully write poetry, so that in all things, including like at the dinner table asking for the salt and pepper, so that in all things we can speak poetically all the time and be elevating our language as much as possible at all times.
Amen. Amen. Well, could you read a couple of your poems, either ones that are published or any new ones you want to reveal here for the first time?
I'll read a couple of I'll read a couple of ones that are already published. So I'll read two favorites. The first one is called God Eats. This one is often requested. Actually, I'm realizing that both the ones I was choosing are sort of free verse. And they're both crowd favorites. So one of the things that we haven't been talking a lot about here is I don't talk often about writing poetry, although of course I do write it. And really, I try to speak more of performing and reading poetry. But anyway, so when I do, I consider them shows, performances. And so this is one of the ones that gets requested a lot. God Eats. So here it is. Stephen was delicious because he was beaten, tenderized by many stones. His forgiveness needed flesh softened by killing blows. Sharper than any butcher's cleaver is the word of God, living and active, piercing to the division of joints and marrow. When finally pierced between soul and spirit, he was made to be a perfect meal. His God was a consuming fire who devoured all his apostles with delight and smelled the smoke of their burning as a sweet aroma. Only their outsides were charred as on a grill or cast iron. Their flesh was rare and easily cut. Andrew and Peter were hung upside down like pheasants, left to age until perfect. This is not to everyone's taste, but monks and martyrs recommend it. Paul was a work of art, stricken, smitten, and afflicted, tenderized several times. On one single trip, he was marinated, slow cooked, and injected with a fiery seasoning designed to amaze. Dry-aged then for 2 years, he was finally drained and offered up quietly without much to do, just as the sophisticates like it. This is an excellent way to prepare an older animal. Only to a privileged few does it fall to be cooked over direct flame. Most of us, like Paul, are allowed to get old, too old, or perhaps it is simply a divine preference for brisket. For your sake, we are cooked all the day long in a little wine, which will finally break down the tougher-habited sinews. It's been a long time coming, but soon the great fork of God will make your flesh to fall tenderly off your bones. The proving's past, the tasting's done, and you served up perfect.
Wow. That's good stuff. A lot of really good connections there.
Thank you.
Wow. So how to do that poem from start to finish?
Oh, how long did it take? That particular poem, I wrote that over 10 years ago now. I think I wrote it in one blind rush. Yeah. Which is not, that only happens well if you've got that copiousness, you know. Right. I would not encourage young poets to think that's the standard way or the best way to write poetry. But that one did sort of come in a rush. And, you know, there are a lot of poems that I sort of think about in the shower for a long time and half write in my head. And many other poets kind of have that same experience. So by the time you sit down, it just starts pouring out.
Right.
Well, since we're kind of sacramental right now, maybe I'll make the next reading. It's a villanelle. So something a little more formal on the Lord's Supper.
Okay.
It's called Thrice Beaten with Rods and Baked into Bread. Is this the body and the blood for real? Or do I eat by sweat of wrinkled brow? Feed on doubt and lust even as I kneel? The words were spoken plain and bare as steel, but I would rate and complicate them now. Is this the body and the blood for real? There is no magic done to see or feel, except a spelling of words and a woven vow. I feed on doubt and lust, even as I kneel. Nor art nor philosophy make of it a meal that does what's solemnly said. He never told how this is the body and the blood for real. Maybe it's animal weakness or social congeal, the sodded quick of boiled bones marrow, where stew the doubt and lust, even as I kneel. But under this red rock is the new deal. Not under. This rock's the whole loaf now. It is the body and the blood for real. Again I feed on bread and wine and kneel.
Wow. Very good. Well, yeah, we've come full circle. We started our last interview. We were talking about the Lord's Supper, and now we finished talking about the Lord's Supper. But yeah, which is a great way to end, because that's like the ultimate poem, right? That's the ultimate metaphor. Christ Amen. Is the ultimate metaphor. Yeah, good stuff. Well, thank you, Joffre, for making the time to talk about Word Horde. We'll put a link in the show notes, as they say, when this goes out. Encourage everyone to pick up a copy, as well as the anthology. Not too early to start on your Christmas shopping, so just throwing that out there. But yeah, I wish you all the best in this new school year, and keep writing those poems.
All right. Thanks. Best to you as well. I appreciate you having me, Gregory.
All right. See you all later.